Behind every great man is a great woman, they say. But behind Robert Redford, there were six, each one leaving a mark so deep that at 89, he's still talking about them. This isn't the Hollywood story you think you know. Some men are movie stars, others become legends. But Robert Redford? He was the man every woman wanted and every man envied. Behind that golden smile and those piercing blue eyes, though, lived someone haunted by love. Love discovered, love lost, and love he never quite released. A man shaped by losses from his earliest days, forged by heartbreak that would have destroyed weaker souls. Born in Santa Monica in 1936 to a working-class family, his journey to stardom was marked by tragedy that started in childhood and never truly stopped. The world saw those sun-kissed California looks, that effortless charm that made him a generation's perfect man. But what they missed was the boy who'd fought polio at 11, confined to bed for weeks, while the same illness that affected presidents threatened his young life. They didn't know about the twin sisters who passed away shortly after birth when he was 10, or how his family handled tragedy by simply never speaking of it, a silence that would define his approach to love and loss forever. Now, at 89, Redford has finally opened up about the six women who shaped his heart. The devoted first wife who stood by him before fame found him. The Hollywood goddess who slipped through his fingers too soon. The passionate flame he couldn't control. The dear friend who might have been something more. And the woman who finally brought peace to his restless spirit. These aren't gossip magazine stories. These are the hidden truths of a man the world thought it understood. What the world didn't realize was that behind those famous eyes lay decades of private pain. Losing his mother at 18, the devastating loss of 2 of his 4 children, and a childhood marked by illness and family tragedy that forever changed how he approached love. Stay with us, because Robert Redford's greatest love stories never made it to the screen. Which of these love stories do you think affected Redford the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Before we explore these romances, you need to understand the man behind the legend. Robert Redford's early years read like a catalog of challenges that would have derailed someone with less strength. Son of Charles Redford, who worked as both a milkman and accountant, and Martha Hart, young Robert grew up where emotional distance was normal. His father worked such long hours supporting the family through the Great Depression that it was Robert's Uncle David who became his real father figure, a multilingual athlete and military interpreter who taught him about strength and character. But even this relationship was meant for heartbreak when Uncle David was lost in the Battle of the Bulge during World War II, leaving young Robert devastated and once again surrounded by his family's silence about grief. From failure to fame, early heartbreak, and broken dreams. Long before Robert Redford became the Sundance Kid, he was just another struggling young man who couldn't seem to succeed at anything. Actually, I was a failure at everything I tried, he'd later confess to Success magazine in 1980. I worked as a box boy at a supermarket and got let go. Then my dad got me a job at Standard Oil. Let go again. The future Oscar winner spent his teenage years taking hubcaps, sneaking into people's backyards to use their pools, and getting into the kind of trouble that worried his family. He might never amount to anything. His college path seemed promising, a baseball scholarship to the University of Colorado. But then tragedy struck when Martha Redford, his beloved mother, who'd always believed he had something in him that was going to turn out okay, passed away from septicemia at just 40. Robert was only 18. The loss devastated him, and he turned to alcohol to cope. I lost my scholarship pretty quickly after I discovered drinking, he later recalled. He became what he called the campus drunk, and either dropped out or was expelled. The details remain unclear, obscured by his own grief and shame. What followed was a year and a half in Europe, trying to make it as an artist, living between Paris and Florence with his paintings and dreams. When those dreams failed to become real success, he held a sidewalk sale of all his artwork in 1958, raising exactly $200, just enough to buy a ticket back to the United States. But this experience, painful as it was, gave him what he called a kind of nervousness, which was good in some sense. I think I'm healthier when things are toughest, and more restless and worried when things are too easy. During this dark period, he met a young woman who would change everything. Lola Van Wagenen, a historian who lived far from the spotlight he hadn't yet found. In his own words, he married her to save my life, recognizing that without her grounding influence, he might indeed have gone off the deep end, as his family feared. Love Story 1. Lola Van Wagenen, the heart that never really left him. Before Robert Redford became a household name, before the awards and magazine covers, there was Lola Van Wagenen. She wasn't a Hollywood starlet or rising actress. She was a historian, a woman of quiet intelligence who lived outside the glare of fame. And in that early chapter of his life, that's exactly what Redford needed. Someone real, someone steady, someone who could see him not as a legend, but simply as Bob. When they met in 1957, Redford was a broken young man. He'd been kicked out of the University of Colorado for drinking problems after his mother's passing sent him spiraling into what he later called campus drunk behavior. He was only 18 when Martha Redford passed away at age 40 from septicemia, a blood infection that developed after she lost twin daughters at birth. The family's way of dealing with tragedy was not to talk about it at all, a pattern that would define Redford's emotional life forever. You bear the brunt of whatever comes your way, and you do it with grace, he'd later say, describing how his family navigated loss by simply moving on in silence. They married in 1958, when Redford was still just another young man chasing dreams he could barely define. In truth, Redford married Lola partly to prove to his family that he wouldn't go off the deep end or pass away at an early age as they feared. I married her to save my life, he later admitted. The world didn't know him yet, but Lola believed in him long before the cameras did. Together, they built a family, raising 4 children, and carving out something resembling normalcy in a life that would soon be anything but ordinary. The first test of their marriage came early and devastatingly. In September 1959, they welcomed their first child, Scott Anthony. The young couple, barely 21 and 20 years old respectively, were overjoyed, but their happiness would be crushed within months. At just 10 weeks old, some sources say 2.5 months, Scott passed away from sudden infant syndrome, crib passing as it was called then. That was a tough hit, Redford would later say with characteristic understatement. It was our first child. We were in New York and we were broke. It was really tough. The tragedy occurred as Redford was just beginning his acting career, making his Broadway debut in Tall Story, literally a one-line part for which he was paid $82 a week. The young father threw himself into work as a way to cope, taking roles that seemed to echo his own experience with loss, including playing the human embodiment of passing in a Twilight Zone episode called Nothing in the Dark. The loss of Scott changed something fundamental in their marriage. Redford, already trained by his family to bear grief in silence, retreated even further into himself. Lola, dealing with her own devastating loss, had to watch her husband struggle with emotions he couldn't or wouldn't express. They would later have 3 more children, Shauna in 1960, James in 1962, and Amy in 1970. But the shadow of their first loss would hang over every milestone, every celebration. Subscribe now so you don't miss our deep dives into Hollywood's most fascinating, untold stories. Yet the very success that Redford worked so tirelessly for became the same storm that tore through their marriage. Hollywood doesn't forgive distance, and Redford's career demanded it constantly. The late nights, the travel, the growing weight of fame, these pressures left scars on their marriage. But there was another, deeper fracture. The couple would face additional heartbreak when their son Jamie was born in 1962 with hyaline membrane condition. a potentially fatal respiratory illness that gave him only a 40% chance of survival. Jamie would struggle with health issues his entire life, eventually requiring 2 liver transplants in 1993. During Jamie's surgeries, Redford would fly from New York to Omaha every weekend while filming Quiz Show, sitting by his son's hospital bed, watching his child fight for life just as he had watched his infant son, Scott, slip away decades earlier. And then there were the other tragedies that tested their marriage. In 1983, their daughter Shauna's boyfriend, Sid Wells, was taken from them, shot in the head, in a case that remains unsolved to this day. Redford halted production on The Natural to attend the funeral and be with his devastated daughter. The following year, Shauna herself nearly lost her life when her Ford Bronco plunged into the icy Jordan River. She was rescued by a local woman named Doreen Staker Rivers, whom Redford later invited to the premiere of The Natural, telling her that saying thanks just isn't enough. Each tragedy wore away at a marriage that was already strained by the demands of fame and Redford's inability to fully open his heart, even to the woman who had saved his life. After nearly 3 decades, in 1985, they quietly divorced. There were no screaming headlines, no bitter feuds in public. Just 2 people who realized they'd grown apart in ways neither could mend. The divorce came at a particularly difficult time. Jamie's health was deteriorating, requiring his first liver transplant, and Redford was establishing himself as a serious director with Ordinary People, a film about family tragedy that hit perhaps too close to home. And yet, even as their marriage ended, Lola never truly left his life. In later interviews, Redford often spoke of her with respect, sometimes with quiet sadness, as though a piece of his heart always remained with her. She wasn't just his first wife. She was his anchor during the years when he could have been lost to fame. She was also the woman who'd stood by him through the unimaginable grief of losing their firstborn, who'd helped him navigate the terror of almost losing Jamie, and who'd shared the burden of a family that seemed touched by tragedy. In a family that dealt with pain by not talking about it, Lola had been his silent partner in survival. And anchors, even when released, leave an imprint on the soul. Love Story 2. Natalie Wood, The Star-Crossed Connection. In the golden haze of 1960s Hollywood, when studios still ruled and photographers swarmed like moths to flame, Robert Redford crossed paths with a woman whose beauty was almost mythic, Natalie Wood. What few knew was that they had a connection that predated their Hollywood careers. Both had attended Van Nuys High School in Southern California, though they moved in different circles then. He was an athlete struggling with his own challenges. She was already a child star who had captivated audiences in Miracle on 34th Street and earned an Oscar nomination for Rebel Without a Cause. By then, Natalie was already the Princess of Hollywood, having grown up on screen and transformed into one of the era's most magnetic leading ladies. To Redford, still carving his place among the giants, she was both a colleague and an enigma. They worked together on several films, most notably Inside Daisy Clover in 1965 and This Property is Condemned in 1966. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable. Redford played the charming drifter, Natalie the vulnerable dreamer, and together they seemed to capture the restless spirit of a generation. Off-screen, their connection deepened into a genuine friendship that would span decades. Natalie appeared in his film The Candidate, and Redford served as best man at one of her weddings. They understood each other in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. Both had experienced the weight of fame from young ages. Both carried private wounds that shaped their public personas. For Redford, who'd learned to navigate the Hollywood machine while protecting his private grief, Natalie represented something rare, someone who understood the cost of stardom without judgment. Off-screen, whispers of a deeper connection began to follow them. For Natalie, who'd long lived under the microscope of Hollywood, Redford represented something different. He was private, thoughtful, unwilling to be swallowed whole by the industry. For Redford, Natalie was both luminous and fragile, a woman whose strength on camera hid the storms within her. He saw in her something that perhaps reminded him of his own family's approach to pain, a beautiful surface that concealed deep struggles. Both had learned to perform strength while privately battling challenges that the public would never see. Friends would later say that Redford cared deeply for her, but he also understood the chaos that surrounded her life. Whatever they shared, whether a fleeting romance or simply an unspoken bond, it left an imprint. When the call came on November 29, 1981, that Natalie had drowned near Catalina Island after falling from a yacht, Redford was devastated. The circumstances of her passing, occurring after she'd been fighting with her husband Robert Wagner, involving a woman who had an admitted fear of water, would remain mysteriously murky for decades. For Redford, who'd already lost so many people close to him, Natalie's loss was another reminder of how suddenly life could be stolen away. Natalie Wood's tragic loss in 1981 shook Hollywood to its core. To Redford, it was a haunting reminder of how fragile even the brightest stars could be. He rarely spoke publicly about her, but when he did, there was a tenderness in his voice, a reverence, as if the memory of her was too delicate to expose fully. Years later, he would tell TCM, "I only wish our paths could have crossed again," the regret evident in every word. Natalie Wood, a reminder that even in the glitter of Hollywood, true connection is fleeting, fragile, and unforgettable. Love Story 3. Barbra Streisand. When Fire Meets Ice. If Natalie Wood was a spark, then Barbra Streisand was a wildfire. By the time Robert Redford and Streisand came together in The Way We Were in 1973, both were already stars. Yet neither could have predicted the cultural lightning bolt their pairing would unleash. The film wasn't just a love story. It was a meditation on passion, politics, and the cruel passage of time. And at its heart stood two characters, Katie and Hubble, who seemed to mirror Streisand and Redford in more ways than audiences knew. The timing of The Way We Were was particularly poignant for Redford. His personal life was marked by the ongoing health struggles of his son, Jamie, who'd been born with serious medical complications and was facing a lifetime of health battles. Additionally, his marriage to Lola was showing signs of strain, as his career demands pulled him further from family life. The theme of the film, about love that cannot survive the pull of different destinies, perhaps resonated more deeply with Redford than anyone realized. He was a man who understood that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome life's cruel circumstances. Streisand, with her unshakable intensity, was the kind of woman who lived every moment at full flame. She brought urgency, vulnerability, and fire to every scene. Redford, by contrast, was calm, measured, the embodiment of restraint. This restraint came from years of containing his own pain. By the time he worked with Streisand, Redford had already perfected the art of emotional control that his family had taught him, to bear whatever comes with grace and without complaint. His cool exterior masked a man who'd been shaped by loss after loss. Together, they were oil and water. And yet, on screen, that tension created magic. The famous scene where Streisand's Katie desperately tries to smooth Redford's Hubble's hair while he sleeps became iconic, not just for its tenderness, but because it captured something essential about their real-life dynamic. Streisand was always trying to reach the man beneath Redford's beautiful surface, while he instinctively protected himself from being fully known. Off-screen, their relationship was equally complex. Streisand admitted years later that she'd been captivated by Redford, describing him as the golden boy. But Redford, fiercely protective of his privacy, kept his distance. His guardedness wasn't just about celebrity. It was born from a lifetime of protecting himself and his family from further emotional devastation. Every relationship was a risk, every opening of his heart a potential pathway to more loss. With Streisand's passionate intensity, he may have recognized something too dangerous for a man already carrying so much grief. For him, Barbara's boldness was both admirable and overwhelming. Where she wanted to dive into the depths of emotional connection, he often held back, retreating into the quiet that defined him. The irony wasn't lost on those who worked with them. Here was Redford, who could convey profound emotion with just a glance on the screen, unable or unwilling to let himself be vulnerable in real life. Streisand's openness, her willingness to be publicly emotional, politically outspoken, romantically available, was everything he'd been trained not to be. And yet, despite that distance, The Way We Were became a film etched in Hollywood history, largely because audiences sensed the truth that Streisand's longing and Redford's restraint weren't just acting. They were reflections of who these two people were in real life. The film's bittersweet ending, where love cannot survive the pull of destiny, mirrored their own inability to truly connect beyond the screen. For Streisand, he may have been the one who slipped away. For Redford, she remained the love story he could only live in fiction, not in life. Share this video with friends who love classic Hollywood stories. They'll thank you for it. The Newman Brotherhood, a different kind of love. Before we continue with Redford's romantic relationships, it's important to understand how his friendship with Paul Newman shaped his approach to love and trust. When they met on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969, both men were at pivotal moments in their lives. Newman was the established star. Redford was the rising talent. But what developed between them was something rare in Hollywood, a genuine brotherhood that would last for decades. Their friendship began with a generosity from Newman that Redford never forgot. The film was originally titled The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy, with Redford's character getting top billing. But Newman, recognizing his own greater star power at the time, suggested they switch the title to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, ensuring the film would be a success while still allowing Redford to shine. This act of professional generosity in a town known for ego and competition was the foundation of a friendship that would see both men through decades of personal and professional challenges. What made their bond special was that Newman became perhaps the only person in Redford's adult life to whom he could be completely honest about his struggles. Newman understood the burden of fame, the pressure to maintain a public image while dealing with private pain. When Jamie Redford was undergoing his liver transplants, Newman was one of the few people who knew the full extent of Robert's terror and helplessness. When Redford's marriage to Lola was falling apart, Newman was there to listen without judgment. This friendship gave Redford a model for what relationships could be: supportive, loyal, based on mutual respect rather than competition. It also showed him what he was missing in his romantic relationships: the ability to be completely himself with another person. The tragedy was that this level of emotional honesty seemed to come easier for him with Newman than with any of the women he loved. Perhaps it was because Newman expected nothing from him emotionally beyond friendship, while romantic relationships demanded the kind of vulnerability that his family had never taught him how to give. Love Story 4. Sonia Braga. The fire that nearly consumed everything. By the late 1980s, Robert Redford had conquered Hollywood, not just as an actor, but as a director and producer who shaped stories with his own hands. He'd also endured more personal tragedy. In 1983, his daughter, Shauna's boyfriend, Sid Wells, had been taken from them, shot in the head in an unsolved case that would haunt the family for decades. The following year, Shauna herself nearly lost her life in a car accident, plunging her Ford Bronco into the icy Jordan River. Redford had suspended production of The Natural to attend Sid's funeral and to be with his daughter as she recovered. By this time, Redford had also achieved something he'd dreamed of since childhood: recognition as a serious director. His 1980 film, Ordinary People, a devastating portrayal of a family torn apart by the loss of a son, had won him the Academy Award for Best Director. The film was deeply personal for Redford, too personal, perhaps. It explored themes of grief, family dysfunction, and the inability to communicate pain that mirrored his own life so closely that he admitted he could never watch the finished film. The project had taken an enormous emotional toll, forcing him to confront his own family's patterns of silence and suppressed grief. It was during this chapter of his life that he encountered Sonia Braga, the Brazilian actress whose presence was nothing short of electric. Known internationally for her fearless performances in Donna Floor and Her Two Husbands and Kiss of the Spider-Woman, Braga embodied passion, fire, and sensuality. For Redford, who'd lived much of his life with guarded restraint, she was a storm he couldn't ignore. For a man who'd spent decades containing his emotions, controlling his responses to trauma. Sonia represented something dangerous, the possibility of feeling everything at full intensity. After years of measured responses to tragedy, of bearing the brunt with grace, of not talking about the pain, Sonia offered him a different way of being in the world. She was Latin passion incarnate, unafraid of emotion, unashamed of desire, unconcerned with the kind of public image that had become Redford's prison. Their connection wasn't just physical. It was cultural, emotional, and deeply spiritual. Braga brought with her the warmth and intensity of Latin America, a perspective far removed from Redford's quiet, reserved upbringing in California and Utah. She lived life unfiltered, without apology, and it both fascinated and unsettled him. The relationship began during a time when Redford was reassessing everything about his life. His divorce from Lola had been finalized. His children were grown or growing. And for the first time in decades, he had the freedom to be emotionally available to someone new. Sonia didn't know him as the grieving father, the controlled movie star, or the careful director. She saw him as a man capable of passion, and she challenged him to embrace that side of himself. Friends close to Redford at the time described their relationship as consuming, even volatile. While Lola Van Wagenen had grounded him, and Barbara Streisand had challenged him, Sonia Braga swept him into a whirlwind. For the first time, Redford wasn't the calm center of the storm. He was caught inside it. Those who knew them described a relationship of extremes: passionate reconciliations and explosive arguments, tender moments and dramatic separations. For Redford, who'd lived most of his adult life in careful control of his emotions, this was both liberating and terrifying. Sonia demanded authenticity in a way that no one ever had. She wanted his real emotions, not his careful presentations of them. But for a man whose surreal had depended on emotional control, this kind of intensity was ultimately unsustainable. Redford had learned early that feelings were dangerous. They led to the kind of pain he'd experienced with his mother's passing, his son's loss, his ongoing fears about Jamie's health. The family motto of bearing pain with grace didn't accommodate the kind of emotional hurricane that Sonia represented. Friends noted that during their relationship, Redford seemed both more alive and more tortured than they'd ever seen him. But passion, as intoxicating as it may be, isn't always sustainable. Redford by nature craved stability. Braga thrived on intensity. Their worlds, as much as they collided, couldn't find balance. The relationship lasted about 7 years, from the late 1980s into the mid-1990s. But it was marked by separations and reunions, periods of intense connection followed by equally intense distance. Ultimately, Redford may have realized that while Sonia could ignite parts of him he thought were gone, she could also burn down the careful structures he'd built to survive his losses. Though their romance didn't last long, it left its mark. In interviews years later, Redford acknowledged Braga with admiration, describing her as a force of nature, someone unforgettable. When asked about her years later, there was something in his voice, not regret exactly, but a kind of wistful recognition of what might have been if he'd been a different kind of man, someone more capable of living at her emotional intensity. Sonia Braga wasn't the woman he built a life with, nor the one he married, but she was the flame he could never quite put out, the reminder that even the most controlled of men can be undone by passion. The in-between years, searching for what he needed. Between Sonia Braga and his eventual marriage to Sibylle Zaggers, Redford had several relationships that revealed different aspects of his search for love. Each woman represented a different approach to intimacy, a different attempt to find someone who could understand both his public persona and his private pain. There was Kathy O'Rear, a costume designer who'd worked on his film The Milagro Beanfield War. Their relationship lasted from about 1990 to 1995, and it represented Redford's attempt at something more conventional after the intensity of Sonia Braga. O'Rear understood the film industry, knew how to navigate the demands of celebrity, and offered him a kind of comfortable companionship. But ultimately, friends said it lacked the depth that both of them needed. Perhaps more intriguing was his brief relationship with Swedish actress Lena Olin, whom he met on the set of Havana in 1990. Their affair lasted only about a year, but it was intense enough that their on-screen chemistry was clearly informed by their off-screen connection. Olin later described Redford as sweet, and those who worked with them noted that their love scenes had an authenticity that suggested real feeling. But Olin, like Sonia before her, was perhaps too much intensity for a man still learning how to be emotionally available. There were whispers of other relationships during this period, with French supermodel Nathalie Nau, and even rumors of a connection with Meryl Streep during the filming of Out of Africa. While Streep has always maintained that their relationship was purely professional, her recent comments about their famous hair-washing scene suggest that the intimacy they shared on screen was deeply affecting for both of them. It's a romantic scene, in a way, because it's so intimate, Streep said in 2024. We've seen so many scenes of people together physically, but we don't see that love, touch, that care. Gorgeous. I didn't want it to end that day. Each of these relationships taught Redford something about what he needed from love. With Kathy O'Rear, he learned that comfort and understanding weren't enough if there wasn't passion. With Lena Olin, he discovered that passion alone couldn't sustain a relationship if there wasn't emotional maturity on both sides. And if there was indeed something with Meryl Streep, it may have shown him what he was truly looking for, someone who could match his professional intensity while offering genuine intimacy. By the mid-1990s, Redford was in his late 50s, a grandfather, and finally ready to admit what he really wanted from a relationship. He wanted someone who could see past his celebrity to the man underneath, someone who wouldn't be overwhelmed by his complicated history, and someone who could offer him the peace he'd never known. He was tired of relationships that required him to perform, even in private. He wanted, for perhaps the first time in his life, to simply be himself with another person. Love story. 5. Sybil Sagers, the peace he'd always needed. By the time Robert Redford met Sybil Sagers, he'd already lived several lifetimes. He'd been the golden boy of Hollywood, the director who reshaped the cinema, the activist who stood against the machine of the industry. He'd buried his mother at 18, lost his first son at 10 weeks old, watched his second son battle through multiple liver transplants, endured his daughter's boyfriend's taking, and survived his daughter's near-fatal car accident. He'd weathered a divorce after 27 years of marriage, and navigated several intense relationships that never quite found their footing. He'd known the highs of fame, the loneliness of divorce, and the sting of loss. And then, when the world least expected it, he found a love that would endure. When they met in 1996, Redford was 60 years old and had spent decades perfecting the art of emotional self-protection. But perhaps, by then, he'd finally learned to distinguish between the chaos that destroys and the peace that heals. The meeting itself was serendipitous. She was a German artist living in Hamburg. He was passing through Europe on one of his environmental missions. They were introduced by mutual friends who thought they might have something in common. Sybil wasn't a Hollywood actress. She was an artist, a German-born painter whose works often carried the hues of nature, the very thing Redford had always clung to for balance. Their paths crossed in the 1990s, a time when Redford had retreated more and more into his sanctuary in Sundance, Utah. The Sundance property had become more than a retreat. It was his healing place where he could process decades of loss, surrounded by the mountains and forests that reminded him that some things endure beyond human suffering. With her quiet spirit and creative soul, Sybil was unlike the fiery women who'd come before her. She didn't demand the spotlight. Instead, she embraced the quiet spaces that Redford cherished most. What attracted Redford to Sybil wasn't just her beauty or her artistic talent, but her complete lack of interest in his celebrity. She had her own creative life, her own sources of fulfillment, and she neither needed nor wanted to be defined by her relationship with a movie star. This was revolutionary for a man who'd spent decades with women who were either intimidated by his fame or sought to use it for their own purposes. Their relationship blossomed not in the chaos of studios and premieres, but in the stillness of mountain pollens and forests. Together, they lived outside the public eye, sharing a bond that seemed rooted in simplicity and mutual respect. For Redford, who'd spent so many years carrying the weight of family tragedies alone, Sybil offered something revolutionary. A partnership where he didn't have to be the strong one all the time, where his pain was acknowledged rather than endured in silence. Sybil understood, perhaps intuitively, that Redford needed space to grieve and heal. She didn't try to fix him or change him. She simply accepted him as he was, a man who'd been shaped by loss, but not destroyed by it. She had her own capacity for solitude, her own need for creative expression, and she could give him the emotional freedom he'd never had in previous relationships. Their courtship was slow and careful, spanning more than a decade. Sybil divided her time between Germany and Utah, and their relationship developed organically, without the pressure of public scrutiny or career demands. They shared long conversations about art and nature, quiet dinners without photographers, and the kind of everyday intimacy that Redford had rarely experienced. After more than a decade together, they married in 2009 in a private ceremony in Hamburg, Germany. The timing of their marriage was significant. By 2009, Redford's son, Jamie, had recovered from his liver transplants and was working as a filmmaker, giving his father hope that perhaps the family's streak of medical tragedies was finally over. The wedding represented not just love, but the possibility of happiness without the shadow of impending loss. The ceremony itself reflected their values, small, private, focused on their commitment to each other rather than any public statement. Unlike his first wedding, which had been partly motivated by his need to prove something to his family, this marriage was purely about love and companionship. For Redford, Sybil represented something rare: peace. She was the steady hand after years of turbulence, the companion who could sit in silence with him and make that silence feel whole. Most importantly, she was the woman who could love him without needing him to explain or apologize for the ways that grief had shaped him. She didn't require him to be anyone other than who he was. Not the movie star, not the director, not the activist. Just Bob. Their marriage worked because it was based on acceptance rather than passion, understanding rather than intensity. Sybil had seen Redford at his most vulnerable and hadn't been frightened away. She'd witnessed his struggles with loss and hadn't tried to minimize or fix them. She simply loved him through them. At 89, when Redford reflects on his life, it's clear that Sybil isn't just a chapter. She's the closing act, the woman who walked with him into the twilight with grace. If passion once consumed him, Sybil offered calm. And sometimes calm is the greatest love of all. Love story 6. Jane Fonda, the connection that almost was. Few Hollywood pairings carried as much natural ease as Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. Together, they lit up the screen in Barefoot in the Park in 1967, where their playful chemistry made audiences believe they were made for each other. Decades later, when they reunited for The Electric Horseman in 1979, and again for Our Souls at Night in 2017, that same magic returned, seasoned, matured, but no less powerful. Their first collaboration came at a pivotal time in Redford's life. Barefoot in the Park was filmed in 1967, during a period when he was establishing himself as a leading man while still processing the early loss of his son Scott and managing the ongoing health concerns with Jamie. Jane Fonda, already politically active and unafraid to speak her mind, represented everything Redford admired but couldn't quite allow himself to be: boldly emotional, publicly vulnerable, unafraid of controversy. And yet behind the laughter and intimacy they shared on screen, Redford and Fonda were never truly lovers. Instead, they embodied something more elusive, a connection that flirted with love, but never crossed the line. Perhaps Redford, who'd learned to contain his deepest feelings as a survival mechanism, recognized that Jane's intensity, her willingness to feel everything fully and publicly, would have been too much for someone who'd trained himself to bear pain in silence. Redford admired Jane's courage, her political activism, her relentless pursuit of truth, her refusal to be silenced by Hollywood's expectations. Fonda, in turn, spoke often of her affection for Redford, even confessing that she sometimes wished they'd been more than just co-stars. There was also the matter of timing and circumstance. During their early collaborations, Redford was still married to Lola and dealing with the ongoing trauma of child loss and family health crises. His emotional bandwidth was already stretched thin by real-life tragedy. He may have instinctively known that he couldn't handle the kind of relationship that Jane would require and deserve. But there was something deeper that kept them apart. Fonda, even in her younger years, was someone who lived her politics and her emotions publicly. She was arrested for protesting the Vietnam War. She spoke out about women's rights. She wasn't afraid to be controversial. Redford, by contrast, had been shaped by a family culture that valued privacy and emotional restraint. While he would later become politically active, particularly around environmental issues, he never had Fonda's comfort with public emotional expression. Their friendship was perhaps more valuable than romance would have been. They could admire each other without the complications that physical intimacy might have brought. Redford could appreciate Fonda's fearless authenticity without having to match it in his own life, and Fonda could enjoy Redford's steadiness without being frustrated by his emotional limitations. But timing is everything, and theirs was never right. Redford was guarded, cautious with his private life, while Fonda often lived boldly, unapologetically, in the public eye. Perhaps he feared that romance would shatter the rare trust they'd built as friends and collaborators. Perhaps he knew that some bonds are too precious to risk. When they reunited decades later for Our Souls at Night, both actors were in their 80s and had experienced their share of loss. Redford, by then, had buried his son Jamie, who had passed away from bile duct cancer in October 2020, adding yet another devastating loss to his long list of griefs. The film's theme, two elderly people finding unexpected love after a lifetime of loss, may have been too close to Redford's reality for comfort. They played two widowed neighbors finding unexpected love in old age, a story that mirrored what might have been. Watching them together, audiences felt as though they were witnessing something deeply personal, a glimpse of what had always lingered just out of reach. The poignancy of their final collaboration was unmistakable. Here were two people who'd known each other for over 50 years, who'd shared countless moments of on-screen intimacy, who clearly cared deeply for each other, playing characters who finally get the love story they never had in real life. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about watching them discover, in their 80s, what their characters might have found decades earlier, if circumstances had been different. For Redford, Jane Fonda wasn't a lost love, but a reminder of one. Proof that sometimes the most enduring relationships aren't defined by romance, but by respect, trust, and a longing that never fades. Perhaps she represented the path not taken, a life where he might have been more open with his emotions, more willing to risk his heart, more capable of the kind of vulnerability that his family's approach to tragedy had never allowed. In the end, their friendship may have been more precious than any romance could have been. It was a connection based on mutual admiration rather than need, on shared history rather than shared intimacy. It was the kind of love that asks for nothing and gives everything. The love of true friendship that can survive decades, marriages, divorces, losses, and the inevitable changes that time brings. The heart behind the legend. Robert Redford's life has always appeared golden to the outside world, an endless reel of triumphs, beauty, and acclaim. But the truth, hidden behind those penetrating blue eyes and that famous smile, was far more complex and heartbreaking. His was a life shaped by loss from the very beginning. The passing of twin sisters when he was a child, his mother's loss when he was just 18, The devastating loss of his first son at only 10 weeks old, his second son's lifelong battle with illness, culminating in passing from cancer, his daughter's boyfriend's tragic end, and his daughter's near-fatal accident. Yet behind the legend lies a man whose heart was shaped as much by heartbreak as by love. From Lola Van Wagenen, who gave him a family, to Natalie Wood, whose fragility haunted him. From Barbra Streisand's fire to Sonia Braga's consuming passion. From Sibylle Sagers, who offered him peace, to Jane Fonda, the friend who might have been more. Each woman left her mark. Each carved her own chapter into his story. In many ways, Redford's approach to love mirrored his family's approach to tragedy. Controlled, private, endured with grace, and without complaint. He learned early that opening your heart fully meant risking devastating loss, and he'd already experienced more loss than most people could survive. His relationships were often marked by a kind of beautiful restraint, a holding back that protected him from complete devastation, but also prevented him from complete surrender. The pattern is clear when you look at his romantic history. He was drawn to women of great talent and strength, but he struggled to maintain intimacy with those who demanded complete emotional availability. Lola Van Wagenen worked because she understood his need for privacy and didn't push him beyond his emotional comfort zone. Barbra Streisand was perhaps too intense, demanding a level of vulnerability he couldn't give. Sonia Braga represented pure passion, but passion without the emotional maturity to sustain long-term commitment. Sibylle Sagers finally offered him something he'd never had: acceptance without demands, love without conditions. The man who could convey profound emotion with just a glance, who could break hearts with his performances, had learned to protect his own heart through careful distance. It wasn't coldness, it was survival. Every love story was filtered through the lens of loss. Every connection measured against the possibility of grief. This is perhaps why his friendship with Paul Newman was so important. It showed him that deep emotional connection was possible, even if he couldn't quite replicate it in his romantic relationships. His children were perhaps his greatest loves and his greatest teachers. Scott's passing taught him that love and loss are inseparable, that the deepest connections come with the highest risks. Jamie's long struggle with illness taught him that love sometimes means watching helplessly while someone you adore suffers. These lessons shaped how he approached romantic love. With caution, with guards up, with the knowledge that every hello contains the possibility of goodbye. Perhaps this is why Sibylle Sagers was able to reach him in ways others couldn't. She offered him not passion, but peace, not intensity, but understanding. After decades of bearing pain with grace, she gave him permission to simply be happy, without waiting for the next tragedy to strike. She didn't need him to be anyone other than who he was, a man who'd been shaped by loss, but not destroyed by it. The Sundance Institute, which Redford founded in 1981, can be seen as another expression of his approach to love. Just as he was careful and protective in his personal relationships, he was nurturing and supportive of young filmmakers. Sundance became his way of giving back, of creating something lasting and meaningful that could survive beyond his own mortality. It was love expressed through mentorship, through the creation of opportunities for others, through the building of something larger than himself. His environmental activism, too, was a form of love. Love for the natural world that had always provided him solace during his darkest moments. The mountains and forests of Utah weren't just his retreat. They were his sanctuary, the place where he could process grief and find peace. His tireless work to protect these spaces was his way of ensuring that future generations would have access to the same healing that nature had provided him. At 89, Redford's legacy isn't only his films, but the loves and losses that made him human. His greatest achievement, as he once said, wasn't his Oscar or his iconic roles. It was his children, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't, all of whom taught him that love is worth the risk of loss, even when that loss seems inevitable. The 6 women who shaped his heart each taught him something different about love. Lola taught him commitment and sacrifice. Natalie taught him that beauty is fragile and connection is precious. Barbara taught him that passion alone isn't enough. Sonia taught him that he was capable of feeling more deeply than he thought possible. Jane taught him that some of the most meaningful relationships exist in the space between friendship and romance. And Sybil taught him that love is at its best is peaceful rather than passionate, accepting rather than demanding. In the end, Robert Redford's love stories reveal a man who was both shaped and limited by trauma. His early losses taught him to be careful with his heart, perhaps too careful, but they also taught him to value the connections he did make, to treasure the people who stayed, and to find meaning in the midst of inevitable grief. His restraint wasn't emotional weakness. It was a form of emotional management that allowed him to survive losses that might have destroyed someone else. The tragedy of Redford's romantic life wasn't that he couldn't love. It was that his capacity for love was so often constrained by his fear of loss. But perhaps that's what made him such a compelling screen presence. Audiences could sense the depth of feeling he was holding back, the passion he was controlling, the vulnerability he was protecting. His restraint made him mysterious. His carefully guarded heart made viewers want to reach through the screen and unlock it. The man who once described himself as a failure at everything I tried became one of the most successful actors and directors of his generation. But his real success wasn't measured in box office receipts or Academy Awards. It was measured in his ability to survive overwhelming loss while still maintaining his capacity to love. That he found peace with Sybil in his final decades suggests that even the most guarded hearts can learn to open, even if it takes a lifetime to learn how. Robert Redford's love stories are ultimately stories about resilience, not just surviving loss, but learning to love again despite loss. They remind us that the most beautiful romances aren't always the most passionate ones, and that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that teach us how to live with both joy and sorrow, connection and solitude, passion and peace. Which of these love stories touched your heart the most? Was it Lola's unwavering loyalty, Natalie's tragic beauty, Barbara's passionate fire, Sonia's consuming intensity, Sybil's healing peace, or Jane's enduring friendship? Tell us in the comments below. And if these hidden Hollywood stories moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dives into the legends who shaped our dreams. Share this with someone who believes in love that transcends time, because some stories are too beautiful to keep to yourself. From the ashes of early tragedy to the peace of lasting love, Robert Redford's journey reminds us that our greatest wounds often teach us our most profound lessons about the heart. His story proves that it's never too late to find the love that finally fits your soul.